Welcome everyone to this third and final session of day 3 of DCBMN's AGM 2021. We have a galaxy of speakers to discuss the topic of sustainable manufacturing in Africa. Over the past couple of days, we've heard, and even earlier this day, we've heard about the importance of equitable access, how it is not just an issue of addressing regional healthcare challenges, but also a matter of national and regional security, as was pointed out. The ongoing pandemic has indeed brought home certain truths with a sense of urgency. While we've heard as to how the issue of access has more to do with distribution rather than supply, it cannot be denied that diversification and expansion of manufacturing bases will certainly not only help address distribution issues more effectively, but also help tackle issues with regard to costs and regulatory challenges as well. Before I invite our first speaker for this session, allow me to remind that each speaker will have about 7 minutes to address the topic assigned to them, and hopefully as we stick to it, we'll be left with some time to address questions towards the end of the session. I would invite the participants, audience, to put in their questions in the Q&A chat box that is provided, and hopefully we'll be able to address a few of them as we come towards the close of the session. With that, let me invite our first speaker for the session, Dr. Matthew Downham. Dr. Matthew is the Sustainable Manufacturing Lead at CEPI and would be addressing the issue of marketplace, the strategic forum. Dr. Matthew, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Samir, and thanks very much indeed for the opportunity to present today at this important meeting. I'm going to be talking about something that arguably Martin Frieder and I have been talking about since about 2016 with the Influenza Gap program when that sunsetted, and that is the sustainability piece, the sustainability requirement. And this is building off a survey that CEPI has conducted a little early this year, mapping vaccine manufacturing across Africa, Latin America, Caribbean, Southeast Asia, Western Pacific, and the Middle East. And what we've identified is a series of aspirational plans that many organizations across these geographies, also in Africa, of course, and countries are wishing to achieve. They're trying to, or they wish to expand their existing human vaccine manufacturing, drug substance, drug product, and or fill finish capacity. So there's a number of activities there to consider and think about moving forwards. They wish to create vaccine manufacturing capacity either at existing pharmaceutical companies, in some cases veterinary institutes, and to support that local demand for vaccine supply to safeguard public health measures moving forwards. They maybe wish to build new capacity, whether it's a multi-product facility, and also in countries where there is no or currently no or limited vaccine manufacturing capacity or capability to date. As well as building out capacity and capability, they want to, there's a lot of response to develop and technically diversify, to build capability beyond what maybe exists currently, which may be more the traditional vaccines or sort of the kind of core portfolio of vaccines to date. And there's a lot of emphasis, obviously, on the mRNA, DNA, and viral vaccine platforms. In other words, changing the dynamics of technical capability, which in turn will require training and resource to support upskilling. The aspirational plans are often linked with international consortia, whether that's from an investment perspective, whether it's been offered, whether it's been identified and supported through private investors, or there is government endorsement or coordination. So there is an awful lot of activity occurring to facilitate vaccine manufacturing capacity capability expansion, establishment, and diversification in terms of technical and core capability. And I guess one of the things to really think about, and this comes back to the sustainability word I used a moment ago, is how investments and how the strategy to build vaccine manufacturing capacity capability moving forward is going to be structured. And then I can see David Robinson's on the phone. Maybe he's going to share some more on this a little later. But there is, of course, the need to avoid that build and decay aspect. In other words, over structuring, over infrastructuring the situation, building too many facilities. To make sure that doesn't happen, there needs to be a strategic consideration about which facilities are needed. Do we need drug substance, drug product over here and a fill finish capacity over there, maybe between two countries, to share the burden, share the financial load, share the strategic coordination, etc. So the first kind of questions really are kind of which facilities are needed, where they're needed, and also crucially, what they will make and supply. And that comes into the sustainability element as well, and careful consideration of the business model moving forwards. For true sustainability, that facility should be self-sustaining in terms of financial revenue. And to do that, it needs to manage the vaccines that it makes to meet the diseases and the management practices for those diseases. So let's say, for example, there's a national immunization program for a specific disease. Well, that will help drive what the facility will do, what its manufacturing infrastructure will be, and also maybe into things like the stockpiling activities required. So there's an epidemiology piece here as well. It's multifaceted. But to really make sure the facilities that are built, expanded or diversified in terms of their core capabilities, that thought process in terms of what is the market dynamic, what is it going to be doing to have a warm base moving forward such that it can be an autonomous, independent entity is key. And that might mean that the facility is not solely making vaccine for its immediate country, but it may be making vaccine for its broader region. It comes down to the numbers game, making sufficient vaccines to be able to sell them at an appropriate price and appropriate cost, competitively so, such that it's not undersold, as it were, by an import, let's say. So it's how to build that sustainability from a business model perspective that will drive the manufacturing expansion, will drive the vaccine locations, and will drive forward the diversification. I think the other area for investment and consideration is the training piece. And there's many organizations, part of DCVMN, of course, that have really started out quite recently. And I think, for example, Serum Institute of India is a case in point. The focus on workforce training, upskilling is not to be, forgotten about, is not to be undermined, and is a key component that is also required for investment and consideration moving forwards. So these are the kind of core thoughts that we have had in terms of that sustainability piece. CEPI wish, of course, to continue very much engaging with local and regional organizations and the champions, the people who have the overall responsibility for the region, the continent as a whole, irrespective of whether it's Africa, Latin America, or so on, to work and consolidate activities to support this sustainable future. Because ultimately the key goal is to diversify vaccine manufacturing and improve epidemic or pandemic response capability through this diversification, and build improved public health security measures moving forwards. So I think with that, I have come to the end of my time, and Samir, can I hand back to you for further progression? Over. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Matthew. I think you touched upon quite a few very interesting themes with regard to sustainability. And importantly, I believe you addressed the point of looking at the regional marketplace rather than country marketplace in terms of making sure that the business models are commercially viable and sustainable on an ongoing basis. And the aspirations of the governments and of the private players in ensuring vaccine manufacturing sustainability for the African continent. Thank you so much for that. And you spoke about diversification of the technology platforms and the portfolio of products, and I believe in there it segues very well into our next topic. And let me, with that, invite Dr. Martin Howell-Friede from the WHO. Dr. Martin, as we all know, is responsible for transfer of technology for health products, WHO Work Stream 3. And I would request Dr. Martin to speak about how can the transfer of technology contribute to this diversification and ensure sustainable manufacturing and diversification of manufacturing bases. Dr. Martin, over to you.
Yeah, thanks very much, Samir. So if we want to set up manufacturing using some new technology, there's essentially three ways to do that. Either we can invent and develop that new technology ourselves. This means that we work from the patents, from the literature, and many of you on this call have already done that. So those of you that are in the more successful of the DCBMs have already undertaken some of this yourselves. It can be successful, tends to take time. Now, the other way is through a bilateral technology transfer. And again, bilateral technology transfer has been very important over the last 20, 30 years in providing the developing country vaccine manufacturers with know-how. But when we do this bilateral tech transfer, it's typically between one single technology donor and one single technology recipient. So it is good, it takes time. Unfortunately, because it goes typically to a single recipient, it doesn't enable numerous manufacturers to acquire the technology. So what WHO has done in the past and is trying to do now with its partners to expand the access to the know-how for some of the emerging platforms is to set up what we call technology transfer hubs. Now, these hubs are really just training centers. They're training centers where a process is established, but not a university level process, a manufacturing level process. And that when that technology is established, other manufacturers, and ideally more than one, because if it's just one, well, then let's just do a bilateral, where manufacturers can come to this facility and learn the entire process from A to Z, alpha to omega, walk out of that facility not only having learned the process, but have all of the SOPs, but also importantly, walking out with the necessary licenses, if these are required, to enable them to practice the technology. And ideally, practicing not just for a single disease such as COVID, but what we're really aiming for is to be empowering the countries to have the know-how, but then to be able to use that know-how for whatever disease targets they feel are important. So this is the concept of the multilateral technology transfer hub. Now, separate to this is the whole need for workforce training. So the hub will provide some workforce training, but ideally the workforce that comes to that hub should already be GMP compliant. They know how to go into a GMP facility, how to dress up, dress down, and how to operate inside that. And something that CEPI identified and WHO confirms is that in many countries, especially those that don't yet have good vaccine manufacturing, it is the workforce that is a problem. So in addition to the tech transfer hubs, we're now setting up a global biomanufacturing workforce training hub, which will be tasked with training workforce every single year continuously, so that there is in the LMICs, there is a supply of workers that have been trained of how to go into GMP facilities, how to operate your standard equipment, your fermenters, your downstream processes and things like that, your filling lines, and that these will be able to contribute. Now, to come back to really the topic, which is sustainability. What's important is that we don't have, let's take Africa as an example. There's 54 countries in Africa. If 54 countries were to set up vaccine manufacturing facilities, this would probably result in 54 white elephants that would soon be commercially unviable and rust. So we need to be working with the regions to ensure that what we set up is part of a coherent strategy for the region. But even when we develop a coherent strategy, we have to be wondering, what else are you going to make? So in between pandemics, there is roughly an equilibrium between supply and demand. It is only during the pandemics that this equilibrium is really thrown out of whack. So if we build facilities to respond to the pandemic, what are these facilities going to do in between pandemics? And this is where it's very important that we facilitate with the tech transfer, not only the tech transfer, which is what we're currently doing, to respond to a pandemic and to be able to respond to future pandemics, but that these facilities are able to produce something in between pandemics. And when we say produce something, ideally it will be producing something using the same know-how, the same facilities, the same staff as they are receiving tech transfer for the pandemic response. So let's just take our example of mRNA. So currently, as you all know, in South Africa, we've set up a mRNA technology transfer hub, and this will be teaching manufacturers around the world how to make mRNA vaccines. But once they've learned how to make a COVID vaccine, hopefully COVID will come to an end one day. What are they going to do with these facilities? So currently, we are working with researchers around the world to identify what are the potential applications of mRNA to routine vaccines beyond COVID, beyond pandemic influenza. And it is really essential that we identify an answer to this and actually identify an answer relatively soon to build the pipeline for these manufacturers. Because if we don't have a pipeline, then I'm afraid that some of the facilities that we build, even if they are capable of responding to a pandemic, if they don't work in between pandemics, when the next pandemic happens, they might have rusted, the staff might have left, or might have forgotten how to operate the facility. So I'm going to stop there, and I look forward to other people's comments and the discussion. Back to you, Samir.
Thank you, Dr. Martin. Very important couple of issues that you raised, and echoing what Dr. Matthew also said, the issue of training of workforce, and it's indeed an interesting development, global biomanufacturing workforce training hub that the WHO is proposing to set up, and that's really something that would contribute significantly to improvement in overall capabilities across vaccine manufacturers, especially amongst the developing country vaccine manufacturers network. And importantly, you also address the issue of viability and sustainability. Indeed, as we've seen, almost 500, we are witnessing about a 500% jump in terms of vaccine doses manufactured globally. The question that remains is, once, hopefully, as we conquer the current ongoing pandemic, what happens to these facilities? And it is indeed important to ensure that the technologies are deployed, and so are the facilities. So thank you so much for that. And with that, let me welcome the next speaker, Dr. David Robinson. Dr. David is from the BMGF, CMC, and polio vaccine product development group on vaccine development and surveillance. And I would request Dr. David to share his points of view on investing for vaccine equity. Over to you, Dr. David.
Yes, so thank you very much. I do have a set of slides to share, and I'll be echoing and perhaps drilling out a bit more on the comments, excellent comments made by both Matthew and Martin. If I could have the next slide, please. And there's a series of 5 points I'd like to make in my brief discussion. And I've heard folks in the World Bank talk about that we've been existing in phases of cycles of panic neglect. It's resulted in what Matthew referred to as a build and decay phenomenon, where we build infrastructure, but if it doesn't get used, as Martin mentioned, it decays. So I want to talk about how we move from this build and decay phase to build and sustain. And the first 3 principles I want to discuss are first, ever warm. As Martin noted, manufacturing facilities need to be in a continuous operation in order to stay in an always ready state, have validations, qualifications, and most importantly, workforce training up to date. In order to do this and to avoid an ongoing drain on financial resources, these facilities need to be generating revenue, enough revenue to cover their cost of keeping that facility open and running. while we believe that mRNA is certainly a major and potentially game-changing achievement and advance, I can't rely upon mRNA alone. As I'll point on the next slide, please, there are a large number of companies involved in innovation in mRNA, and this is just a partial listing of them, a non-comprehensive listing. As you can see, many involved in developing vaccines for COVID-19, but looking at numerous targets in addition to that, such as flu, RSV, malaria, TB, HIV, among others. However, all those products are still very early in development, with just a few of them having even entered into phase 1 studies. So when the next mRNA vaccine will come along is really anybody's guess. This could be 2 years from now, it could be 3 years, it could be 5 years, it could be longer. And so for facility to really be driving revenue, there needs to be more than just mRNA vaccines that facility has the technology to produce. Next slide, please. And while COVID-19 is certainly the driver and the very severe inequity that we've seen in terms of distribution of COVID-19 vaccines, really provides the very strong rationale and impetus for further diversifying vaccine manufacturing. The reality is that routine vaccines are going to have to be the products that are paying the bills in between pandemics. And as been pointed out by both Matthew and Martin, one needs to think about a market that's regional, not just global, as only a handful of countries have a population large enough to really support a domestic market to generate revenue. And as just pointed out by our chair of the session, there could be a great oversupply of vaccine capacity by the time we exit the current pandemic, and hopefully do exit the current pandemic within the next year or two. And as such, companies that go into the vaccine business now are going to be entering into a very competitive marketplace and competing sometimes against very large suppliers who can reach things to economies of scale. So we've been investing in new technologies that will allow companies to produce things economically through new technology and compete with economies of scale. But as pointed out on the next slide, even if we look at a case of using these new technologies to produce a vaccine, such as shown here, an example of rotavirus vaccine, produced in advanced bioreactor technologies. What you see here, in order to have a positive return on value, net present value, you need a volume of at least 50 million doses per year. For something like a rotavirus vaccine that's given to infants, this is really reliant on the birth cohorts, and only a handful of countries around the world have populations greater than 50 million, let alone a birth cohort greater than 50 million. So to be competitive, one's going to have a regional or global mindset. Next slide, please. So what we propose is that anyone seeking to enter this business or expand their business really needs to consider multiple parameters and look at this from a portfolio approach, not from a single product approach. What we've been doing is looking at a handful of products that be representative of what one might want to bring to the marketplace in the near term, and trying to see how one would prioritize those and what revenue one might generate relative to cost. So looking at things like categorizing them a platform. Do you have the technologies available to produce these different types of products? What are the supply gaps? What are the market health dynamics? How complex are the products to make and or distribute? Can you include novel products that might be coming to market shortly? Which ones would you include? And finally, some expert opinion, input, and opinion to review these to come down to a priority list of products. And we hope to be able to share those. Share this list with you shortly, but this is just a representative list. Every company's going to have to do their own analysis and assessment, see what works for them, for their company, and their marketplace. Next slide, please. So in conclusion, I'd just like to point out sustainability, as I point out, is extremely important. You encourage developers, donors, and investors to think about how to make a manufacturing facility financially viable in the time period between pandemics in order to move from build and decay to build and sustain model. we've provided one example of how to do market assessment, how there's many ways to do this. The important thing is that companies do this and take a portfolio approach. Now, along with the portfolio approach, also the importance of being able to take a regional or global lens in order to ensure that there's revenue to keep the facility ever warm and running and ready for the next pandemic while driving revenue and providing value to global health in between pandemics. That I'd like to close my comments and thank you for your time and thank the organizers for inviting me to give these brief remarks.
Thank you, Dr. David. And indeed, build and decay is really one of the challenges that must be staring all manufacturers today, because there has been an unprecedented response in terms of scale up of manufacturing capacities with regard to the COVID pandemic. And as you said, as we hopefully exit, we would have a global oversupply of capacity that would be available and not just limited to vaccine manufacturers, as I'm sure you would appreciate. I think all the three speakers have very pertinently identified the challenges and issues that manufacturers are likely to face, and that probably gives me the best opportunity to invite our next speaker, Dr. Morena. Dr. Morena Makona is the CEO of BioVac, and who better than him to speak about the challenges that vaccine manufacturers in Africa face. Over to you, Dr. Morena.
Thank you very much, Samir, and thank you for the invitation to this panel. In actual fact, it's very good that one speaks after the prior speakers, because what they have said really, whether it's about workforce, about technology, or it's about capacity, is something that is very, that is facing the African continent prior to COVID and will be facing Africa post-COVID. Just like to pick on, what David just spoke about in terms of capacity and having overcapacity, knowing that there is a big momentum now on the continent to build capability with individual companies or through the African CDC and the PAVM efforts. And many are asking and will be asking, Africa, why do you need capacity when there is so much capacity in the world? That question is already starting to filter through. And I'm sure, given 2 years' time, people will be asking that and say, but there's so much capacity, why do you still want to have capacity on the continent? I mean, the short answer to that is that, the fact that we find ourselves in this situation now, is because precisely of that question, and that has always been there. In actual fact, it's not only coming in COVID, but it's always been there to say, but Africa, why do you want to have capacity when other parts of the world have so much capacity? Unfortunately, because no capacity was built on the continent, or sufficient capacity was not built on the continent, we find ourselves here. So I think as African manufacturers, we have a question that we need to answer for ourselves in terms of how are we going to make sure, well, let me start this way. We don't have a choice but to build African vaccine manufacturing capacity, regardless of where the capacity is going to be in the world, because we don't want to find ourselves in the same situation. So I think that should not, for me, even be a question. Africa needs to have larger capacity. Now, the question is, how does Africa now go about building that particular capacity, assuming that there's going to be overcapacity, assuming that there's going to be technologies that perhaps as African manufacturers we're not going to be having access? How are we going to build capacity when some are doubting if we can actually absorb the technology? When some maybe are questioning whether there's enough workforce development? When some are questioning whether there will be demand out there. Now, all the questions that are being posed, I think we are looking at them, while some of them may be coming as skeptical, but we are taking on those questions, because when you take on those questions and you embrace them, you then have to look at ways that you can have innovatively in terms of building capacity that perhaps is different or should be different from how other parts of the world have developed capacity. So if we take 20 years ago, prior to 2000 or prior to Gavi, and we look at where the industry was, I mean, just look at the DCVM countries in terms of where they were versus now. Now we know that a lot of that momentum has given rise to a large DCVM members to be where they are now. Okay, so whilst a lot of them were, I mean, it was their internal efforts, and we need to praise that, but they also utilized the space that was given to them with the purchasing capacity, that a more stable purchasing capacity and a predictable demand that the likes of UNICEF and Gavi came up, which was not there prior to those, prior to 2000. So therefore, if the external factors that have given rise to our members being so large, the question is, are those mechanisms sufficient to get African manufacturers to be competitive? On one hand, I would answer yes, because we need to be part of a global game. But on another, we then have to look at Africa specifically and say, what is unique to us and what is it that is deliberate, that has to be formed, that is deliberate? And that's why I'm sure we're going to have a case from Africa CDC speaking about what deliberate efforts need to be made, because without some deliberate efforts, the status quo will remain. And so that is one of the messages, that in Africa, we have to be deliberate about some things, and we need the global community to do that. Now, Africa in itself has to come to the party, so it has to be balanced. We should also just not hope that the world is going to help us, without us also coming to the party in terms of what we need to respond to. But firstly, there needs to be a deliberate effort. Other deliberate efforts has to be about long-term demand on our continent. So we have 54 countries, fairly fragmented in terms of purchasing, and a large part of those are dependent on Gavi. And so I think we're asking both those, the established purchasing organizations, but together with African member states, to ensure that there's long-term predictable demand. And to some extent, that long-term predictable demand has to deliberately foster African manufacturing demand. So as an example, there has to be said that a portion of what we need to procure has to come out of the continent. That has to be a deliberate effort as one of the ways to be sustainable. Now, if you have that as one of the major pillars that will change the dynamics on the continent, we as enterprises then need to ensure that we respond to what the previous speakers have spoken about, and ensure that we have proper workforce, and that is maintained, and that is agile, and that won't go to other continents. We need to make sure that we just don't pick technology just because it's the flavor of the month. We need to ensure that we diversify our portfolios to not only be looking at the current dynamic, but to look at vaccine, sustainable, even routine vaccine manufacture. And if we need to go into biologicals where they are synergistic with the current capacity, we need to do that. And that is the onus that we have to have, assuming that a predictable demand would there. But for me, the first starting point is to make sure that there's predictable demand that would want African vaccine manufacturers, now whether it's African countries themselves or is a global community. And we have examples of countries that want that. Brazil is one of them. They want you to be a local manufacturer in Brazil, but not many countries are like that. And Africa does not even have a single country that is insistent on that. There is a like, there's a want, but there is no deliberate effort as far as that is concerned. And so for me, once all of that is in place, then issues like access to funding, which is quite important, would then follow a little bit better, because the environment, the enabling environment would have been created. But again, the responsibility would be on both the companies to obviously put together a business case, and then the money will follow. But even the money would need to also understand, when we access long-term funding, that how a funder in, if a funder is funding a vaccine manufacturer in China versus US, Europe, India, that has to be different from Africa. Africa has its own nuances, and therefore we cannot put the same blinkers and say, well, we've done it in India like this, well, Africa follows suit. It doesn't work like that. So we need long-term patient funding, And we know that that all has to be repaid, but that would look at Africa in its own eyes, and also ensuring that the previous aspects I've spoken about are already in place. So with that note, Samir, I'll just maybe pause there, but I just wanted to give that perspective from a local front.
Thank you, Dr. Morena. Some very interesting points and issues raised by you. Predictable demand, sourcing for Africa, from Africa, at least in part, funding availability, the challenges in terms of diverse countries across the continent and having very diverse purchasing capacities. These indeed are various challenges that manufacturers must face, and I'm sure are facing and are finding some solutions to those. Let me invite Dr. Nikesh Ndembi, Chief Science Advisor to Africa CDC, our next speaker, to speak about the initiatives rolled out by PAVM and the roadmap ahead for the African vaccine manufacturers. Dr. Ndembi.
No, thank you so much. I think we share the common vision with the previous speakers, more so with really Morena. We have been discussing things at length, and it's quite important. That's the raison d'être of Africa CDC and Africa Union. Being able to look at that with from a different lens, and also support member states to enable us reach our continental aspiration. Let me just probably get to, before I get to really the meat, the core of my presentation, that I also share that same concerns around the market shaping. I share the same concerns around fragmentation. And that's where we need more than before to really move into that same direction. And if we have that vision of producing over at least 60% of vaccine by 2040, there should be that deliberate effort to collaborate, communicate, build that partnership, being able to exactly explore a key component along the value chain where we can all contribute. So I'm saying that because we have a very strong business case. That's very important. That the finance, as Morena mentioned, will follow, because if we are really all the enablers are all together, that's quite clear. That's going to make it a successful plan. That's why we came up with the Africa Union, and that has been endorsed over the weekend by the member state, where PAVM should be at the center of this and in supporting local vaccine manufacturing. We've paid visit to some of these calls that are in that particular field, including Morena, at Bauvac, Aspen, Vaxera, and quite soon we're going to be in other countries, Senegal, including Rwanda, and all our front runners. The reason being able to understand what are the challenges, interact with them, socialize, and be sure that where we invest or put money in the basket will be of value for them to actually improve their production line moving forward. So if you may, at least just if you look at this slide, this is exactly what we all agree is a way forward, our global health security. Over 99% of the vaccines currently being imported, only 1% produced locally. That sounds really unacceptable, which is good in terms of public health security. But the other downside, when we're moving at this pace, where there's a political will, I think we see already some appetite from donors and the big financiers, is to see, do we have a market shaping and demand intelligence that will be actually being able to respond to the current dynamics? I'm saying that because we see Vaxera, it's a good example of that. In 2022, they're going to produce over 1 billion doses of Sinovac vaccines or so. And that is already beyond that local consumption, even with the free trade agreement. I think we need to put that into consideration as we are actually scaling, which we are actually working closely with some. So meaning that discussions around market shaping is very important and moving forward. So now what I have is it's a very simple slide giving you some of our key roles both in the short and long term. There are 6 work streams, if you look at it, that we've kept on actually being able to look into. We will look into the market design and demand intelligence, regulatory strengthening, access to finance, technology, and intellectual property, R&D, hubs, talent of development, and infrastructure development. These are important. The reason being, if we, as this particular juncture, we have 2 countries that have achieved maturity level 3, at least for the product. Let's put it that way. Then if we put it again, those that have ratified what we call the African Medicine Agency's treaty, they are very few. So we are trying now to be able to bring that, strengthen that regulatory environment, ensure that it's more harmonized, less fragmented, the ED region, each of them having their own regulatory platform and system. So that's one of the mandates, and that enabling environment is quite critical. Research and development, R&D and hubs and talent development, more so tech transfer. We've been in touch with at least several vaccine manufacturers, and the plan here to be able to really reach out to them, being able to then be kind of interface and facilitate that for our member states and also the vaccine manufacturer that are currently in that space. That goes a long way in terms of providing that enabling environment. All of this on this call, we have heard about Moderna and the 500 million doses and the mRNA platform on the continent. We immediately had to engage with Moderna to be able to provide, really have a clearer picture so as to advise on how to move forward. In addition to our mRNA, the mRNA tech transfer hub that is in South Africa. We really want to see that fully operationalized. And Africa CDC is pushing, using all the political leverage to be sure that we get, have at least one of those fully operationalized in Africa and then beyond even the continent. So I'm not going to touch base on this. It's just to say we have a governance structure. We're really working closely with partners to be sure that we get this our vision and aspiration to 2040. This is a little bit the journey. It's not a one-night journey. It's a long, really term journey. And all of you, even on this call, I think we think one way or the other, you're part of it already. So we plan actually by Q4, I think we're already in, to release our framework for action. We're going to open our strategy, different pillars that we have to really that discussion before we get into the continental strategy. But the focus really and the major point of discussion, content of discussion now with donors is around the market shaping. We've heard the signal. We can easily get the regulatory component in place. R&D, we've seen that, South Africa, West Africa, the level of research and development, universities, network of universities. There's an enabling environment there, but they still have, we still have to address and being able to convince our donors around that market shaping, even post-COVID, if you look at it that way. So this is a long list, and that gives you really, you can appreciate the complexity of the issue. Yeah, we have the big players here, population-wise, technology-wise, research context, all the enablers probably available in some of these. This is a long list, over 17 countries for a continent for 1.3 billion. So you understand where we are at the African Union. It's not in an easy position. And we plan to support all those member states to meet also their national, not only their national, but also continental aspiration. So some of the activities before I wrap up. So the engagement of the consortium working to boost vaccine production in South Africa is one of really our key deliverables. We've anchored the team from Afrigen. We started that conversation. As I've said, discussion with BioVac started earlier. And all this is probably enabled to be able to provide all the political support and also financial through the different grant mechanisms we have been able to secure. The engagement of AU fund runners, I provided the list. Not all our member states are at the same level. We all agree that. And we, by actually our principle of equity, we all put them together, but we're quite sure that the level of support might not be the same as we, and then also probably along the value chain, some actually choose to just go for drug substance and probably other small molecules. So the engagement with global donors that had happened, we had a very fruitful funders forum in South Africa in September, very interesting, where over 80 donors were on that call and they were pledge made. That's really important. And that's part of what also we are supporting as from Africa Cities engagement with WHO around the regulatory and maturity assessment. Some of the key players that we've heard of, the MasterCard Foundation. They have secured 1.3 billion. Team Europe have made a commitment of 1.2 billion, and that is happening, as mentioned, the Founders Forum, where we're close to mobilizing what is needed for at least 5 years plan for the SA mRNA tech transfer. I think I fully align. We might not be having issues around finance now. It might be around our strategy, how to be more building a really strong business case and economy of scale. Then to conclude, again, I align with Morena here. We're looking into it in a very carefully. First, the prioritized diseases, we're looking at about 22. We went from 50, we shortlisted, ended up with 22 diseases that we felt we should prioritize based on the burden, and we group them by legacy, expanding, and outbreak, and then also technology. Yeah, it's quite interesting. I'm a fan of mRNA, being a virologist by background, for sure. But we want to be sure that we keep that balance if we really want to meet our aspiration of really manufacture about 60% of vaccine. It should be a combination between the traditional and innovative platforms. So live attenuated, inactivated, the subunit, virus-like particle, the viral vector, and RNA or DNA platforms or technology. And then also, let's not forget that the end-to-end will require for some of the member states with that aspiration quite some time. So if you really want to hit the ground, when the rubber hit the ground, is to get that combination. So some of those will go for drug substance, some will definitely focus on that fill and finish, and then we're going to strengthen our capacity for R&D and regulatory as well from the different hubs that we plan across the continent. I've mentioned this already, so I'm just going to skip. Thank you for inviting Africa CDC, and I'm delighted to be here. Thank you. I'm back to you.
Oh, thank you, Dr. Nikesh, and indeed a very impressive and ambitious roadmap, and congratulations on the work already done with regard to priority diseases being identified, with regard to the 6 work streams being identified, those pillars being put in place, as you very rightly pointed out, political will, the appetite of funders and donors, capacity building. Each of these are obviously going to be very, very important. With that, let me go to Dr. Janet. Dr. Janet is a senior program officer with NEPAD, and request her to share what are the plans for boosting local vaccines production in Africa. I believe it segues very well from the previous speaker. Over to you, Dr. Janet.
Thank you so much, Chair, and everybody else who has spoken before me. I really appreciate the work that so far has been done by the different bodies that have spoken. In particular, I would like to congratulate the Africa CDC in the manner in which they have handled issues ever since COVID struck in Africa. And they have really taken up our frameworks, the continental frameworks that had already been adopted by the African Union leadership since 2005, and actually translated some of those aspects into real tangible projects that the member states and the regional economic communities as well as the global community are beginning now to also support implementation of. The African Union Development Agency, NEPAD, draws from our mandate to interface with international and regional stakeholders to implement AU priority and flagship projects, one of which the Pharmaceutical Manufacturing Plan for Africa, which seeks to boost local production of pharmaceuticals in Africa and other health technologies to grow. Also, we draw from our mandate to provide technical advisory support that is based on evidence, as well as thirdly, to mobilize resources both from the financial and human resources to support our member states, particularly with the intention to accelerate regional integration. So most of the work that we deliver seeks to pool countries together or groups of countries together via existing structures such as the regional economic communities. Some of you have been talking about working as individual countries is not going to make our markets viable for this type of exercises. So having a platform where we are able to bring structures such as the regional economic communities to work together will ensure that there is a bigger market and maybe reduce the fragmentation in that aspect so that we can attract investors in any sector whatsoever. It doesn't have to be vaccine manufacturing, even other sectors will be attracted to such kind of defragmented markets in Africa. So the structure, I mean, the framework that has provided a basis for building projects for most of the people who have spoken before me, particularly WHO and the Africa CDC, has drawn from the business plan for promoting local production, which seeks for Africa to have quality of medicines that are produced by African manufacturers, to make those medicines accessible, to make them available, and most importantly, to ensure the affordability of those medicines. But we realize that we cannot achieve that from the public health point of view without having a viable industry, which we also would like to promote competitiveness of the industry, sustainability, and self-resilience. We actually are working, and I think through this COVID-19, we have been made to realize that it's not good for Africa to depend entirely on importing medicines, be it generic medicines or even these newer formulations. So our plans are already exist actually. What we are going to continue to engage our stakeholders to do is to ensure that the solutions are packaged along these lines that I'm going to highlight and stop my speech from here. These are the areas that we're going to continue to engage all of you stakeholders around the table and others outside of this room to ensure that we align with. This is number one, human resource development. We have already talked about the fact that we need capacity if we have to build a vaccine manufacturing capability that's viable. Product and technology access. We have already mentioned, and many others have also mentioned, that we need to access the product and to access the technology. So packages of solutions should be around that area. And I see already Africa CDCs through the PAVM already doing that. Access to affordable capital and time-limited incentives. Regulatory system strengthening. We have already seen how the African Union is supporting the ratification of the establishment of the African Medicines Regulatory Harmonization Agency, AMA. And then packages or solutions around which will foster partnerships, collaboration, and business-to-business linkages, as well as packages or solutions that integrate the market and also the market data information, because without understanding the market data, we will not attract investors in this space. And so we need packages of solutions developed to establish and strengthen data systems, especially in relation to market information. Lastly, we are going to continue as AUD and NEPAD to engage member states, particularly at the regional level, to continue with the commitment at a political level. So political commitment is going to continue to be one of the areas we'll focus on, ensuring that governments are really committed to establishing a viable local production system. And then we are going to ensure that at the regional level, there are policies that are coherent to ensure a viable vaccine manufacturing ecosystem. And finally, we are going to continue to ensure that even at national level, there are sector-specific strategies that countries would have to align and be coherent with when it comes to a successful achievement of the objectives of our continental strategies related with access to much needed vaccines and other medical products. Over to you, and thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Dr. Jonathan, and indeed very important points raised, especially with regard to preparedness and how different agencies are playing the role. Before we go on to concluding remarks, I believe we have just a couple of minutes for some quick questions, a couple of questions. First one to Dr. Martin, if Dr. Martin could switch on his camera and unmute himself. The question is with regard to how do we tackle IPR related challenges when it comes to technology transfer? Are we any nearer to addressing those than we were in the past? Dr. Martin, for short comment. Thank you.
Okay, so this is a pretty technical question. Okay, so this really depends where you are and what do you want to do. So let me just go to some of the basic IP issues here. So the first observation that you can get mRNA to express as a protein in cells if you modify the nucleotides. This was invented, as you all know, from the University of Pennsylvania, Drew Weissman and his colleagues there. Now, the patent on that, this was filed in 2010, 11, and this was only filed in the OECD countries. Then at about the same time, there was a Canadian company called Tecmira that became Arbutus. They recognized ionizable lipids compared to the original DOTAP cationic lipids. These were able to entrap the RNA inside these lipid nanoparticles. And they got a very interesting set of patents, family of patents around that, which again were only filed in the OECD countries. So if you were to go for the basic use of a pseudouridine rather than a methyl pseudouridine inside lipid nanoparticles using the lipids as described by the Tecmira, well then as long as you're not in the family of USA, Canada, Australia, Japan, Korea, Hong Kong, Singapore, etc., then you will discover that you have freedom to operate. So this then comes down to the question of what are you going to try to do? So that if you decide that you want to use a specific lipid, I'm going to call a spade a spade. Let's say you want to use SM102, which is the Moderna lipid. Now this has been patented. Again, the SM102 patent is not filed in every single country. It's only filed in a limited number of countries. So depending on what country you are in, you might have freedom to operate to make anything that you want in terms of mRNA. If you're in an industrialized country like the USA, it's very likely that you're going to run into intellectual property barriers. Now, I think so. The one surprise which you might find is that a few countries there is a patent deposition system rather than a patent filing system. And in those countries, patents that are extremely broad, such as claim a method of staying alive, which comprises breathing in and breathing out, such a patent might actually be granted in those countries. In which case you might need to consider what your options are in terms of opposition, in terms of revocation, and in terms of compulsory licensing. It's a technical question to which the answer is complex and technical. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Dr. Martin. And with that, I think we are coming to the hour. Before I invite Mr. Suri, Mr. Rajendra Suri, for his concluding remarks for both the session and the event, I'd like to thank all the speakers and the participants. And thank you so much, DCBMN, for having me. Thank you. Mr. Suri, over to you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Samir Desai. This was a fantastic panel discussion, and I must thank all the panelists for sharing their very valuable and deeper insights about what is going to happen and how we can support Africa to achieve self-sufficiency in manufacturing. So thank you once again. And going over to the concluding session, and I must say, first of all, wow, how amazing and intense these 3 days have been. And in fact, it is my honor to present and share the concluding remarks for the 22nd DCBMN AGM held from October 19th to 21st. At the very outset, I would like to recall vividly the remarks made by the Honorable Minister of South Africa, His Excellency Dr. Nimande, in his inaugural address, appreciating the contribution of developing country vaccine manufacturers in mitigating the COVID-19 pandemic. However, he also left us with a very clear message that there is an urgent need to address the vaccine inequity and making Africa self-sufficient in vaccine manufacturing with active collaboration of the industry. Dr. Tedros, Director General WHO, in his keynote message, while lauding development of COVID-19 vaccines in a record time, did emphasize the failure of humanity in achieving vaccine equity. In fact, his sincere wish to build a healthier, safer, and fairer future for all people would, in fact, act as a guiding principle for all of us. Dr. Bruce Aylward, lead accelerator, minced no words to convey the harsh reality that the pandemic is not yet over, and if we don't put our act together, there could be a potential loss of 5 million lives in 2022, with a revenue loss of exceeding USD 5.3 trillion by 2026, as per an IMF report. It was very inspiring to learn that the entire UN is with developing country vaccine manufacturers who are crucial and the central part of Act A mission. It was heartening to learn from Dr. Seth Berkley, CEO Gavi, that DCBMN are playing a key role in making vaccines affordable to millions of children in LMICs, and the cost of immunizing a child with 3 new vaccines has been reduced substantially by 57% through competitiveness and innovation by the developing country vaccine manufacturers. He further emphasized the speed on in-house R&D, project building, and collaboration with other developers and manufacturers to develop and produce COVID-19 vaccine, which is a proof of DCBMN's commitment to global health. Dr. Seth went on to say that Gavi remains committed to supporting DCBM as core members of the Alliance in their effort to achieve collective and noble goal. A clear message from Dr. Richard Hatchett, CEO CEPI, centered around the theme of new platforms, new institutional arrangements, new methods, new concepts of preparedness, new regional partnerships, fully backed with a strong political will, which summed it up all. Dr. David Caslow, CSO CVIA PATH, brought home the point of vaccines as global public good. In fact, the deliberations and interactions by learned speakers on all these 3 days focused on the need to control the pandemic and protect people and economies across the globe, bridging the equity gap by expanding regional capacities through sustainable business models. Dr. John Nikenga Song, Director Africa CDC, rightly brought out the fact that vaccine production is a national security issue. Both Mr. Thomas Cuny, Director General IFMA, and Dr. Michelle McMurray Heath, CEO and President Bio, representing the industry, were extremely supportive of ensuring vaccine equity through strong innovation model, collaboration, scale up, scale out, and tech transfers, which will help generate 12 billion doses of COVID-19 vaccine in 2021 and doubling next year. Financial institutions, the likes of IFC, Afrexim Bank, Imperial College of London, Nimble, and many more advocated new access strategies and new tech transfer strategies as also to support public-private partnerships to ensure more vaccines are produced in Africa for Africa. One of the key enabling factors that emerged is the technology and modality adoption, for which learning quotient, emotional quotient, and intelligence quotient are the key requirements. Global and regional financing mechanisms are the need of the day. Two other very important aspects that were discussed at length are the novel methods of genomic sequences for virus and variant characterization, and the regulatory mechanisms, pathways, and flexibilities, not only for COVID-19, but also the routine immunization vaccine for achieving harmonization, faster pre-qualification, and reducing the impact of these diseases. We are very confident the build and sustain strategic model as propagated by BMGF, along with an ecosystem and enabling factors, would help not only achieve target of reaching 40% vaccination of global population by end of 2021 and 70% by mid-22, but would also sustain facilities even during non-pandemics and deal with the issue of overcapacity. So now, ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of the co-chairs of the organizing committee, Mr. Patrick Tipu and myself, I would like to take this opportunity to extend our thanks, first of all, to the Honorable Minister, His Excellency Imande, for gracing the occasion with his benign presence in spite of an extremely tight schedule, and sharing the vision of His Excellency Cyril Ramaphosa, Honorable President of South Africa. I would also like to thank especially Dr. Tedros, Dr. Seth, and Dr. Richard Hatchett for their very supportive messages, acknowledging their sincere regret of not being able to attend in person. My best of thanks to all the speakers who could in person deliver their extremely rich presentations with highly valuable content, which was the core of this AGM. I would also like to extend thanks to our co-host, Dr. Morena, CEO BioVac, and Mr. Sai Prasad, Chair DCVM and Board, as also to all moderators and especially you all, ladies and gentlemen, and members who, the participants who made this event a grand success. In fact, my heart goes out to thank all our sponsors, without whose support this would have been a mission impossible. I would be failing in my duty if I do not thank promoters of VFAIR's platform, and especially the platform host Cheyenne and technical experts Alon and Salman and others in the back room. At last, but not the least, now I would like to thank our organizing committee members, Sonia Villesnor in the forefront, fully and ably supported by Sonia P, Prerna, Tana, Laura, Benoit, Sivashan, Michelle V, Michelle B, Melissa, and Tamire for their dedication, devotion, and determination, not to mention the sleepless nights in organizing this event. Once again, a very big thank you to you all, my friends. With this, we conclude 22nd AGM. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, and stay safe, everyone.
Thank you. Bye, everybody.